Hi guys. Okay, so today I'm going to show you how to make a classic double pie crust. A double pie crust just means that it's going to have a crust on the bottom and then on the top. So this is really common with any type of fruit pie usually that you make, like apple pie. Um, Also, if you make chicken pot pie, there's usually a crust on top. So this recipe is going to make enough for that, for the top and the bottom of a regular 9-inch pie plate, which is what most people have at their homes. So I can actually show you guys what that looks like. A 9-inch pie plate looks like this. All right, some are metal, some are glass, some are ceramic. It just depends what you have. So in my mixing bowl right here, I already have my dry ingredients. I have my 2.5 cups of just regular all-purpose flour, and I also have 1 1/4 teaspoon of salt. So I am using salt because I'm using unsalted butter. If you had salted butter, you would want to not use the salt just because you don't want it to be too salty. All right, so I'm just whisking my ingredients together to make sure that my flour and my salt are evenly mixed. And then the next thing that I'm going to add is my fat. So I'm going to use 2 different types of fat for this crust. I'm using shortening, which the brand name is Crisco that a lot of people know it by. I'm using 1/4 cup of that. I've already had it packed into my measuring cup here. So if you're using shortening, make sure you pack it in like brown sugar because it's a solid ingredient. So I have a 1/4 cup of that. And then I have 10 tablespoons of cold unsalted butter. So I actually just took my butter out of the freezer and I've cut it up into chunks. If you guys can see that. So all I did was I cut the butter in fourths lengthwise, right? And then I kind of diced it up. So it gives me these nice little chunks. It's going to be easier to work it into the flour with my pastry blender, this little tool here. So I'm going to go ahead and put this in. And I'm also going to add my Crisco. And I'm going to just kind of toss it around in the flour a little bit to keep the chunks from sticking together. And you want to be careful to not touch the butter too much because it does have a pretty low melting point. You want to keep it cold so that it stays solid. You don't want it to start melting at this point. You don't want your butter to melt kind of at all until you put it in the oven to make your pie. Okay, so I've got it tossed up in there and I'm going to add my shortening. And again, I want to try to keep it kind of in chunks. I'm going to add it a little bit at a time. And then I'm also going to toss that in the flour. So some people might think or ask, why are you using shortening too? The reason is because shortening actually has a higher melting point than butter. So it is less likely to melt outside of the oven than butter. It's easier to work with. So you might come across pie crusts that only use shortening, which is totally fine. It's not going to change the flavor. It might actually end up having a better texture for you, especially when you're new to making pie crusts, because it won't melt in your hands. You don't have to worry about touching it too much. However, the downside with shortening is that it has trans fat in it. So I try to stay away from it as much as possible. But when you get to things like pastries and pie crusts, it's kind of hard just because of that issue with the melting points. Okay, so I'm going to toss that around. So, and then butter gives it, that flavor that shortening really doesn't. You can buy butter flavored shortening, but again, it's not as healthy for you as butter is. All right, so what I want to do with these now is I want to use my pastry blender to cut my fat into my flour. So I'm just going to do a rocking motion around, and then I'm going to stop when it's coarse crumbs. So there's going to be chunks of butter in there or shortening, and you're going to be able to see them. And that's what you want because that's going to give you that flaky pie crust when it comes out. If you wanted it to be a sturdier pie crust, you would just cut the fat into the flour more, and then your pie crust wouldn't be as likely to fall apart on you when you're eating it. So it would be better for a really liquidy fruit filling, like a berry pie. Whereas a flaky crust would be fine for like a pumpkin pie or a cream pie that's really solid and not very liquidy. So I'm going to cut this in, and then I'll show you guys what it's going to look like when I'm done. All right, so I just want to show you guys this process. I wish I had a better angle to show you, but I'm just kind of rocking this. And you don't really want to touch this, you know, as I said, because you want to keep it as cold as possible. So even like at this point, if you're like, man, this is taking too long, you could stick it in the freezer so that you wouldn't have to worry about the butter melting. So you kind of just want to make sure that you have as much of the flour taken up with the fat as possible. That way you end up with a nice pie crust. Okay, that looks pretty good. So I'm going to show you guys what this looks like. I wish the resolution was better on the computer, but it's not. So it is what it is. When I show this to you, you'll be able to see some bigger chunks of fat mixed up with some smaller ones. And that's what we want, because that's how pastry is. It's not all going to be the same. Okay, I don't know. Let me see. Move this down. I don't know if you guys can see that very well, but that's what it looks like. So now that we have that mixed together, our next job is to add ice cold water. So I got a really big measuring cup, filled it up with ice, filled the rest of the way with water. I let it sit so it can get nice and cold. 1 second. Because you know, the colder it is, the better for the butter to keep it from melting and stuff. So here's my measuring cup. And we're just going to add the water 1 tablespoon at a time. And in between each addition, we're just going to toss it with this fork to get the water mixed in with the rest of the ingredients. So the recipe says about 6 to 8 tablespoons, or I'm sorry, 6 to 10. So it just depends, like it did with when we were making the bread. It depends on the amount of humidity in the air. For some reason, it always seems like I need to add up to the highest amount. And sometimes I've even had to go past the highest amount just to get it to the right texture. So how do you know when you've added enough water? Well, you should be able to form it into a ball without it falling apart. And when you can do that, that's enough water. So I will probably check it. That's 3 tablespoons. You have to keep count while you're doing this. I'll probably check it after 8 because I'm pretty sure it's not going to be good after 6. And then we'll see if it's holding together. So there's lots of pie crust recipes out there. There's ones that just use butter. There are ones that just use shortening, and then there's ones that have a combination. All right, so this is not as sandy anymore. It's starting to get, you know, more cohesive, which is what we want. You might even see some recipes that use, you know, like there's always going to be different recipes for everything. But my suggestion, advice to you guys is make sure that you look for ones that a lot of people have either rated or reviewed or both. If it has, you know, if there's a lot of ratings for it and it has a good review, then it's probably going to be a good overall recipe. So when you're starting out baking, that's what you want to look for. You want to look for those recipes that a lot of people have tried and have overall liked. And one website that I like to use, or that I always go back to, is allrecipes.com. It's been around for quite a while, probably since before you guys were born, like the early 2000s. So there's some really good recipes on there. You can always go to Pinterest, you know, but sometimes people are just reviewing like their friends' things that have blogs, so that's not always accurate. And you know, there's not some people give things 5 stars and they've never even tried it before. So go to All Recipes. That one's more credible, I feel like. All right, so I'm going to show you guys what this looks like without me, you know, clumping it together with my hands, because you can see that it's starting to come together more. And I'm just going to take some out and see if it sticks together. Okay, so it's starting to stick together, but it's still crumbly. I'm going to add a couple more tablespoons and then check. And you want to make sure, again, you're not like messing with it too much. All right, so not only do you want to keep the butter from melting, but another reason you don't want to handle pie crust too much is because you don't want the gluten to form in it. So I know with the bread, we are all about the gluten, you know, keep kneading the dough, develop the gluten. With pie crust, pastries, you do not want to develop the gluten. You don't want them to be stretchy and hard and tough. You want them to be tender and soft and fall apart. That's how you want them. Because once you introduce liquid into your flour, then your proteins in the flour start to come together and they form gluten. Right? Okay, let's see. Okay, this is actually really good. It's not falling apart at all. So I'm done. So what I'm going to do with what I have here is make one ball of dough. And then I'm going to split it into 2 because this makes a double pie crust. Some of it doesn't want to stick together and I don't want to touch it too much, so I'm trying to be careful. All right, so I'm just going to take it now, split it into 2 as evenly as possible. I still have some stuff hanging out on the bottom, so I'm going to try to get that into the mix. So what you're going to do at this point is take each half and you want to form it into a disc. And then you're going to put it in the refrigerator. So you usually want to keep it in the refrigerator for at least an hour because you want the butter to get cold again that's inside of there. And you want to give your dough time to relax because remember, we don't want to overwork the gluten. So we want to let it rest. Okay, so there's one. And if your hands start to get hot, take a break, run them under cold water, dry them off, start over again. Some people even like to put a bag of ice, like a gallon-sized bag of ice, onto their countertop before they start to roll their dough out, because that keeps things cold and it keeps your butter from melting. So you can do that too if you're having trouble. This one's kind of falling apart on me. All right, now I'm going to show this to you guys. I don't know if you're going to be able to tell with the computer the way it is, but there are chunks of butter in the dough. So I don't know if you can see them. There's one, there's one, there's one. And that's how you want it to look. It shouldn't look all uniform like your bread dough did or like your muffin batter. Okay, so that is how you make pie dough. And then I'm going to put this in the fridge and we will continue this with the apple filling. Okay.